Okay, I want to welcome you to the program. Those who are watching, this is a little bit off the cuff. I had plans of doing this earlier in the week, and then I was really tired. I was going to do it yesterday, and I just didn't have the mental stamina. I was really tired, so I postponed it to today. And I said I'm going to do it at 6 o'clock tonight. And then all of a sudden, around 3:45, I got the impulse, and I said, "Let me just do it now because I don't know how I'm going to feel in a couple of hours." This is a really important lesson. This is something that I've been thinking about. I've been looking at all the different pros and cons of, Second Peter being, canonical, being non-canonical, being written by Peter, being not written by Peter, all the critical versus conservative material that's out there. Been looking into it for probably many years, not as long as I've been dealing with the whole preterist futurist thing, but I've been really looking into this for a while. And so I've come up with, and I'm just going to give you a theory. I'm going to throw some stuff out there. I'm kind of being inspired a little bit by Jeremy from New Heaven and New Earth Unveiled. I'm just going to give you the material that I have, and I'm going to throw it out there, and then you guys could decide for yourselves whether this is the true view or not. I just want to say that I've entitled this podcast, the problem of Second Peter versus Jude, because there is a difference between Second Peter and Jude, and what I find is that they're written from two different historic standpoints. So if you read most of the conservative literature on Jude, and of course First Peter and Second Peter, you'll find that most chronologies they claim that they're written roughly around the same time, prior to the fall of Jerusalem, maybe AD 64 to AD 66, somewhere around that time frame. But when you start looking into the epistles themselves, you find that, First Peter, you could see First Peter being written prior to the fall of the temple, because of course, the end of all things is at hand, and they're about to go through a fiery trial, and the house of God is about to be judged. Judgment is about to begin at the house of God, and so you could see that angle. Even with Jude, you could see when you start examining, getting down to the details of Jude's epistle. You could see where, there's scoffers that have entered the church, false teachers, and then Jude seems to place the second coming in that generation. He said, Enoch the seventh from Adam prophesied of these. That is the false teachers that he had just described, saying, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints," etc., etc. So he's placing the second coming within that time frame. Now, when you get to Second Peter, the tone changes. The historic standpoint is quite different, and so this is why I believe, and I've taken different view on this in the past. I believe that Second Peter was written before the destruction of the temple. I no longer hold that view. I believe, after rigorous research and after months of just comparing what writers have said on the subject, I believe that Second Peter was probably written like 20 to 30 years after First Peter. Now, what I want to do is, because there's a great deal of scholarly debate, and even Orthodox scholarly debate, concerning whether Peter wrote this epistle. And so I've got some material behind me that I could read. I've been looking at critical commentaries. I've been looking at both tradition, classical, written a long time ago, and then written more recently. But what I want to do is I want to share something from F.W. Farrar, who is really one of the greatest scholars of the 19th century. As a matter of fact, he was, I believe he was Queen Victoria's chaplain. And he was a partial preterist, but he wrote an excellent book on universalism. It's called Judgment and Mercy. It's probably one of the most comprehensive books on the subject of universalism. He wrote books on the church fathers. He wrote books on doctrine. He wrote A Life of Christ. He wrote a book called The Early Days of Christianity. It rivals anything that Schaff ever wrote. And so what I'm going to be reading from is an excerpt from his book entitled, I believe it's called Texts. Oh boy, I think it's called Texts Explained, and he goes through and gives all of these texts and what they mean. So anyways, he goes through the whole New Testament, but this is on his intro to Second Peter. He says that, and I'm going to pull some other research down in a moment if I have time, and then we'll get into what my theory is concerning Second Peter and what the author is trying to teach. So F.W. Farrar says this epistle offers many problems for consideration. Its genuineness is less certain than that of any other book in the New Testament. Renan pronounces it to be certainly apocryphal and says that among true critics, he does not think it has a single defender. Of course, Bishop Wordsworth writes with strong and sweeping dogmatism and condemnation of those who doubt whether it is the work of the apostle. But Bishop Ellicott more wisely says that it is inexpedient to encumber the discussion by an attempted reductio ad horribile of one of the alternatives. So he says, he goes on to say, and this may be a little bit boring, but you'll see where I'm going with this in just a few seconds. He says it is undoubtedly canonical. For 15 centuries ago at the Council of Laodicea, it was admitted into the canon. But the authority of the Church of the 4th century at an epoch when criticism as a science was but little known is not sufficient to establish its genuineness. And of all the books of the New Testament, it has the smallest amount of external evidence, and it offers the greatest number of internal difficulties. So now we're going to go into the external evidence, and I'm going to read pretty much what he says, because it's pretty much what all critical scholars say. So if you read in pretty much all scholars of whatever stamp who have looked into this issue, even Arno Gaebelein talks about some of this in the introduction to his commentary on Second Peter. So he says, number one, he says it is not certainly referred to by a single writer of the 1st or 2nd century. So I believe that's true. I think Origen was the first to mention this epistle. He said it is not found in the Peshitta Syriac nor in the Vetus Itala, and it is not unmentioned in the Muratorian canon. So that was about 170 AD. Clement of Alexandria only alludes to one epistle of Peter. Origen doubted its genuineness. It was rejected by Didymus, Eusebius of Caesarea, Theodore of Mopsuestia, and other fathers. He says when criticism revived at the epoch of the Reformation, its genuineness was questioned by Erasmus, Luther, Calvin, Cajetan, Grotius, Scaliger, Salmasius, and other great scholars, and it is now regarded as spurious by the most learned scholars and critics, both in Germany and England. So this is correct. The external testimony is very weak, and there's a lot more external testimony for Jude. For instance, Jude is, I believe, mentioned in the Muratorian canon. Jude is mentioned by some, is quoted by some of the early church fathers, which is why I believe Jude was written first. In other words, Peter is, the author of Second Peter is actually building off of Jude. He's copying off of Jude rather from Jude copying off of Second Peter. We'll get into that in just a moment. But he says, as to the internal evidence, he says, oh boy, I should have probably brought my water with me. As to the internal evidence, it differs from the first epistle, as even St. Jerome saw, to a very remarkable degree in style, character, and structure of words. It abounds in unusual, poetic, and startling expressions, such as to walk behind the flesh, eyes full of an adulteress, the murk of darkness, the heavens shall pass away hurtlingly, the judgment is not idle, the destruction is not drowsily nodding, chains versus pits of darkness, hurling to Tartarus, to blaspheme glories, and many other eccentricities of language used to clothe conceptions which would have been capable of perfectly simple and commonplace expressions. Its style is rugged and tautological. So tautological, I believe that means like saying the same thing over again or saying the same thing in different words, whereas that of the first epistle is smooth and dignified. These difficulties, which are only specimens of many more, are increased by the consideration that the epistle, if genuine, must have been written under identical conditions with the first and within a short time of it. And this makes it very difficult to explain the expression from the days that the fathers fell asleep. Again, why in this epistle should the writer call himself Simeon Peter as in the first, and in the first epistle Peter? Let me just go down. So he gives a lot of the internal evidence here, but he also says a great part of the second chapter is a rifacimento. I believe that means recasting of the epistle of Jude, and it is unquestionable from resemblances which cannot by any possibility be accidental, either that the writer had read Josephus or that Josephus had read this epistle. Now, Josephus, I believe he finished his writings in AD 93. I read that. I have that in another one of my books. And so this had to have been written after AD 93. But Farrar goes on to say, it must be confessed that a priori the former supposition is by far the more probable. How indisputable is the certainty that one of the two writers must have read the other may be inferred from many expressions. First, I believe fully pointed out by Dr. Abbott in the Expositor, and especially from the comparison of two marked passages of Josephus with this brief letter. He says, in the preface to his Antiquities, Josephus says that Moses thought it necessary to consider the divine nature, without which he would be unable to promote the virtue of his readers. That other legislators followed after myths, but that Moses, having shown that God was possessed of perfect virtue, thought that man should strive after virtue, and that his laws contain nothing derogatory to the greatness, megaleotes, of God. The remarkable expressions here flow quite naturally from the subject and the style of the writer, but though they occur nowhere else in the New Testament, we find in 2 Peter 1:16 the greatness, megaleotes, of Christ, and the phrase following after myths. In 1:4, we find the divine nature, and in 1:3, the amazing word virtue, almost unknown in the New Testament, because the Christian's ideal is not mere virtue, but holiness ascribed to God. Now, in Josephus, the phrase is perfectly natural, since he is contrasting the ideas of virtue in God's revelation of himself to Moses with the shameful vices attributed to heathen deities. But in 2 Peter 1:3, it is not only abnormal, but startling. So he says the record by Josephus of the last words of Moses. There are at least 8 phrases almost unknown to the New Testament, and some of them not even found in the Septuagint, which are all found in this epistle. So he goes on to say there are some words, in the first epistle. There's some similarity of language, but it's pretty much certain that Peter didn't write this epistle. Now, I have also from one of my biblical encyclopedias said that the first writer who is expressly named is Origen. I'm not going to go through all of this. Irenaeus is supposed by some to allude to 2 Peter, but I don't believe that these are real quotations. So people will go through and they'll try to find citations from 2 Peter and the early church fathers, and all they seem to be is really accidental approximations to some of the language that Peter's using. There's no explicit reference to 2 Peter in any of the patristic literature written during the first 3 centuries. Catholic epistles, let's see. Eusebius doubted it. Jerome doubted it. And so here we go again from the American Commentary on the New Testament. So you see where I'm going with this. I'm not going to bore you with all of this detail, but what I'm saying is that there's a great difference in 2 Peter between 1 Peter and 2 Peter, and that in between Jude and 2 Peter. And it's really a question of imminent versus protracted expectancy. Now, why is this important? Because most conservative scholars are saying that 2 Peter was contemporaneous with Jude, and Jude's representing the second coming as an event that will happen in his lifetime, whereas Peter is correcting that notion. So my theory, and I'm going to just make sure I'm not missing anything here. Okay, so I'm gonna quit with that, because I think I've outlined what some of the more salient points of criticism are regarding 2 Peter, that a lot of scholars, and this is not just coming from critical scholars, this is coming from Orthodox, creed-affirming, confessional, Christian scholars will tell you that 2 Peter, or rather Peter didn't write 2 Peter. So let me go ahead and stop the share, and let me go ahead and share my Bible Hub, because now we're going to start getting into my theory. We're going to get into the nitty gritty. What was Peter doing, or what was the author doing when he wrote this epistle? And this is actually going to floor some of you. This is probably going to upset some of you. This is probably going to offend some of you. And I'm sorry if that happens, but it's something that I think is necessary. If you get offended, I think that's a good thing, because it's going to help make you think. Okie doke. So my theory is this. My theory is that 2 Peter was written to rehabilitate the credibility of the apostolic predictions regarding the end, since they had failed to happen on time. He's addressing apocalyptic failure. And we've gone into the external testimony as far as, there being very little external evidence in favor of Peter actually writing this epistle. It's very different from his first epistle. And of course, I think Jerome said that it was because Peter had a different, he used interpreters. In other words, he spoke to his interpreters, and then his interpreters wrote it down in Greek. So Mark was his interpreter at one point, I think, for his first epistle. Mark may have been his interpreter, and Mark was his interpreter as far as the gospel, the Gospel of Mark. But now we're getting into, well, perhaps Peter had a different interpreter. I don't really believe that theory holds a great deal of water. I think they are two different writers. And Calvin questioned it. Grotius rejected it. Hugo Grotius, he actually rejected the epistle. Erasmus questioned it. So we're even getting into the reformers here are even questioning this epistle. But what Peter's doing, I think, what he's doing is he's actually combating this notion that the second coming, he's not necessarily denying that it failed. What he's doing is he's trying to rehabilitate the apostolic teachings concerning the second coming. I'm going to show how he does that in just a moment. So we're going to go through some of the internal evidence of this epistle, which shows which proves my theory. Firstly, I think that this was written way after the fall of Jerusalem, because we have in 2 Peter 1:18, we have a mention of the voice coming from heaven, a reference to the gospel. So the gospel had already been in circulation at this time. And it's a reference to the transfiguration, which talks about the parousia. In fact, he uses this word parousia, but he talks about the voice that came to him from the excellent glory. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And this voice which came from heaven, we heard when we were with him in the holy mount. Now, there's a lot of criticism out there that will tell you, yeah, this phrase holy mount, this suggests that we're at least one generation removed from the apostles, because now the places associated with Christ's earthly ministry have become holy places. They've become places of pilgrimage. They're holy places now, whereas, during Christ's lifetime and during the lifetime of the apostles, they never really used this language of something, being a holy location, because it was associated with Christ or his apostles. The most potent piece of evidence here, and of course you've probably heard of this. You probably heard this mentioned before in any kind of debate on 2 Peter, was when he says in chapter 3, verse 4, he's talking about the scoffers. So going back to Jude, remember how Jude said he paints these false teachers in very similar colors to how they're painted in this epistle. But he said that they had come in at that time, and that they were going to be destroyed at the second coming. He talks about the judgment of the great day. He talks about Enoch's prophecy that the Lord was going to come to destroy them. Well, Peter the author in this epistle here, 2 Peter, he's not really denying that they're present. But what he's doing, I think he's using a homiletic sort of tactic. And what he's doing is he doesn't want to deal with them. He doesn't want to be too confrontational, because when you look at what he says of some of these teachers, he speaks of them as though they're already on the scene. But then he says in 2 Peter 3, verse 3, knowing this, that there shall come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming. So he kind of, he kind of, pretends that it's off in the future, right? Maybe he's, engaging in, homiletic or sermonic, guilt manipulation. Maybe he's trying to, make his, the false teachers feel guilty by saying, hey, look, these are the guys that are going to come at the end of time, and they're going to, bring in this doctrine of the Lord not coming speedily. But they're there in person, because when he talks about them, as we'll find in just a moment, he talks of them as if they're already present. And even preterists will have to say, well, look, yeah, last days, we were saying they're the future, but they were in the last days. So he's acting like it's future, but it's actually happening right in front of him. So he says, where is the promise of his coming? And then he says, this is what he says that the scoffers are saying. For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Now, he has to be referring to the apostles, because if he's talking about, okay, so this phrase, the fathers, he could be talking of the patriarchs of, say, the Jewish church, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the fathers of the tribes. He could be talking about those guys, or he could be talking about the fathers of the Christian church, the 12 apostles. I believe he's talking about the fathers of the Christian church, because what force does it add to the argument to say, well, since Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the 12 patriarchs passed away, the second coming hasn't happened. Well, they passed away centuries before Christ came on the scene. So it doesn't add anything to the argument to say that, the patriarchs, the Old Testament patriarchs, passed away and all things have continued. But it adds quite a bit of force to say that the apostles have passed away, because they were the ones that were told by Christ, there be some standing here that shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And of course, he spoke that in the context of rewarding all men according to their works. So he's speaking of it in eschatological context. He said, this generation shall not pass before all these things take place. He placed his second coming in first century for the lifetime of his first century contemporary audience. And if that generation passed away, then yeah, this adds a great deal of force to the argument of the scoffers. They're saying, because the fathers fell asleep, because all of the apostles are dead now, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation, which, by the way, this phrase, from the beginning of the creation, this shows, see if I can highlight this. This shows, of course, that they understood the church to be teaching. I don't know if they believed this themselves, but they must have understood the church is teaching that this would be some kind of cosmic event, not just simply the destruction of the temple. I mean, they if they had a preteristic sort of understanding where they thought that it was just going to be the destruction of the temple or the expulsion of the Jews, they would have said, well, since the fathers fell asleep, the temple is still standing, or since the fathers fell asleep, they're not making this argument. They're saying, since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Where's the sun and the moon, darkening of the sun and the moon? Where's the stars falling from heaven? Where's all of this stuff that was going to happen? The shaking of heaven and earth. Where's this great eschatological catharsis that they were told to look for, that was to happen in that lifetime before that generation passed away? Since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were. And so this is really the only way that you can interpret this. You have to understand the fathers as being the apostles. Otherwise, the argument doesn't make any sense. It's like, well, somebody hundreds of years ago fell asleep. What does that have to do with the second coming? There were people that came, there were people that fell asleep since the second coming. But if that whole generation passed away, if all of the apostles were dead, including John, by the way, who, I think it was Irenaeus who said that he lived to the times of Trajan. So Trajan, I believe he He ascended the throne in 98 AD. So I'm thinking that he couldn't have lived much longer than that. I mean, John, the Apostle John, can't have lived much longer than 100 to 102, 103 AD, because he was very old in 95 AD when a lot of people say that the book of Revelation was written. He was like in his 90s. So if he lived to the time of Trajan, he must have died shortly thereafter. So I'm thinking that this epistle must have been written probably around like AD 105 to maybe AD 110, because all the apostles had to pass away and nothing happened. In other words, the second coming failed. And this is why I was talking about this, I think it was last week. It's a failed eschaton, because the second coming had failed, because Christ said that he was going to come back before some of them had passed away. He said, this generation shall not pass away. And it didn't happen. And the scoffers came and said, hey, remember that promise? Well, all the fathers have fell asleep, and all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. So all things continuing from the beginning of creation. We just went through that. They expected a cosmic catastrophe. And Paul's letters had, here's another piece of evidence. And we'll go back to this. We'll go back to how he addresses this in just a moment. But let's see. In the same chapter, in verse 16, he speaks of Paul's letters being collected into a corpus and being regarded equal to the other scriptures. So he says, as also in all his epistles, Paul's epistles, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do also the other scriptures, unto their own destruction. Now, it's very clear that in AD 66, well, let's put it this way. In AD 66, there's probably no external evidence that Paul's letters had been collected into a corpus and were being viewed as other scriptures. Whenever the scriptures are mentioned in the New Testament, it's always talking about the Old Testament scriptures every single time. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think that any reference to the scriptures is talking about, in the genuine canonical writings, is talking about anything else in the New Testament. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that's why I'm putting this stuff out there for you guys to examine, and then you guys can weigh in and tell me what you think. But by the time the letter's written, Paul's letters have been collected into a corpus and are on equal par with the other scriptures. While that may not fit a first century scenario, it would certainly fit, say, 20 to 30 years after Paul had died. That would certainly fit, because at that time we have the Epistle of Clement. We start getting into, I think there's epistle that Polycarp writes. Then, of course, a couple of years, maybe like 120 or so, you start getting into the epistles of Ignatius. And we know that at that time, Paul's letters are considered scripture. But in AD 66, it just doesn't hold water. So that's just some of the internal evidence that we have, which suggests that this was written at a later date. In addition to the external testimony, which suggests, of course, that the writer had read Josephus, that he had that the differences in language, etc., that we just went through when I was reading from Farrar. So Peter's dealing with the scoffers, and this heresy comes up saying, well, this generation has already passed away, and guess what? Nothing happened. There was no cosmic catastrophe. There was no signs in the sun and the moon. There was no second coming. And so how does the writer, I should say, how does he respond to this? So his response is threefold. He responds to it with three arguments. And the first thing he does is he reminds them of the flood. He reminds them that, prior to the flood coming upon the world in the days of Noah, the world thought that the good times would never end. They were marrying and giving in marriage. They were, They were buying, they were selling, etc. And then all of a sudden, suddenly, the catastrophe fell on them. So what he's doing is he's saying his argument is that, well, don't think just because things continue as they always have, don't think that that's proof that the Lord won't fulfill his promise. Because if you go back to the days of the flood, and he may be alluding to Christ's teachings as well, that it will be as in the days of Noah, in the days of Lot, when the second coming takes place. He's saying, well, remember that in the flood, they were saying pretty much the same thing. They thought that the world would go on forever, and then they were destroyed catastrophically. All of a sudden, they were overwhelmed in this destruction. And so he's using that as a fulcrum, because he's using precedent and saying, well, that's what they were saying during the flood. They said that all things would go on, but then look what happens to them. That's his first argument. His second argument, and I'm going to kind of reverse the order of these as he presents them. His second argument, which is actually his third argument, but I'm going to deal with it as a second, is that he's delaying, God is delaying his judgment to bring all to repentance, which is just a just observation, right? So he didn't do this, he hasn't done this yet. He's still withholding his hand from judging the world because he wants all men to come to repentance. And that's I mean, you can't argue with that. I mean, that would be a reason for delay, wouldn't it? His third argument, which is actually his second in order of his arguments here, his third argument, and this is the big one, and he says, he's delaying because God's time is not man's time. So what he's doing is he's giving it a little twist. He's the first person who's coming out with this argument. Well, I understand about the quickly thing, but God's time isn't as our time. God's time, with him, 1,000 years are as a day, and a day is as 1,000 years. So what he's doing is he's doing what we see a lot of the Amils do, saying, well, soon doesn't mean our soon. It's God's soon. So he's revising the standard of time. He's readjusting, he's resetting things based on the fact that the second coming was promised to happen in the first century, and it failed. So what can we say about this 1,000 years are as a day, and a day is as 1,000 years? He's getting this, of course, from Psalm 90, so he's being biblical about it. But we also know that during the lifetime of Christ and the apostles, they were speaking in man's understanding of time, because Paul said, now is your salvation nearer than when you first believed. This shows that it's a very small compass of time. He's not talking about thousands and thousands of years. He's not talking about hundreds of years. He's talking about, like, this could happen anytime. It could have happened in AD 30. It could have happened in AD 40. It could have happened in AD 50. The Jews were told to repent. They were told to repent, that God would come and blot out their sins corporately, as he had promised in the Old Testament. And of course, they didn't repent. We know that story, right? And so they were set aside. And then the Gentiles were called in, grafted in, to participate in Israel's national and covenantal privileges. So that's, let me see, I seem to be missing a page of notes here. Let me just get my bearings. So that, I believe, okay, so that's pretty much where I think he's going with that. So he's revising. So his historic standpoint is totally different from Jude's. Jude's historic standpoint was the same as First Peter, where, judgment is about to begin at the house of God. He's going to purge out all of this non-elect material. He's going to make a separation between the wheat and the tares. That's why Jude speaks in scathing terms about all of these false teachers that had infiltrated the church, and they're about to be purged out. In fact, the second coming is going to be the event that brings that to happen, because Enoch, the second from Adam, prophesied of these and said, the Lord, he cometh with 10,000 of his saints to judge all of them, and etc. In the book of Revelation, he says, behold, I am at the door. I'm about to come to judge all men according to their works. So we have these epistles and these writings written before AD 70, where it's just like, it's about to happen, it's about to happen, it's about to happen. John said it was at the 11th hour. They were at the 11th hour, and then all of a sudden nothing happens. And when we get to 2 Peter, now you have these scoffers coming in saying, since the generation already fell asleep, and nothing happens. All things continue just as they had been from the beginning of the creation. And so now the author has to deal with this. He has to address this. So his argument is, and we'll get to his rationale in just a moment. But we have to deal firstly with the question of, or with the issue, the objection that this was written prior to AD 70, because the preterists still say, well, this was written prior to AD 70. This was written contemporaneously with, say, 1 Peter and Jude, and of course, everything was fulfilled. So the scoffers weren't right; they were wrong. So their interpretation is that the scoffers are basically saying, I mean, I'm not really sure exactly what argument the author is objecting to. Apparently, if it's written before AD 70, then the scoffers are basically saying that the second coming wasn't happening soon enough. In other words, it hadn't failed. It was just God was taking too much time. And that, to me, that doesn't make any sense of Peter's, because when you look at Peter's apologetic defense of the faith, it doesn't seem like that's the argument he's addressing. It seems like the argument that he's addressing is that the second coming had failed because that generation had passed away and nothing happened. And now he has to rehabilitate the teaching authority of the church and hold out for a future second coming after it had failed because it didn't happen on time. They still had apostles alive. If this was written prior to AD 70, then there were still apostles alive. Peter was alive. John was alive. Perhaps Paul was still alive. So if their argument was basically that the second coming was taking too long, all he had to say was, well, the generation hasn't passed away yet. Give us a chance. Give God a chance. There's still some of that generation. We still have apostles. The temple is still standing. Look, there's a war going on. The Jews are in the middle of a war right now with Rome. It just broke out. This is, if you go back to the Gospels, this is a sign of the end. The end. We're at the 11th hour right now. He should have been responding to them with those arguments if this was written before AD 70, instead of responding saying that the day is 1,000 years. Well, if Christ said that he was going to come back before that generation passed away, then what sense does it make to say a day is as 1,000 years? Well, it can't take place 1,000 years from the time he's writing, because he said he's about to die. He's about to lay down his life. That generation is about to pass away. So if he was thinking if he was arguing that, that now he's starting to delay the coming now, well, then that just invalidates everything that Christ and the apostles said to that generation. He's got to be speaking post-failure, post-postponement, however you want to phrase it. He can't be addressing the argument that the second coming just wasn't happening soon enough. The Jews were at war of Rome, and like I said, that was a sign of the end. All he had to do was point to what was happening in the Middle East and say, hey, I know the temple is still standing, but the Jews are at war with Rome. There's Roman armies and legions all over Judea. They're taking cities siege. They're defeating people. They're making their way toward Rome or what have you. And this is a sign. This is a sign, one of the signs that Christ gave us of the end. Therefore, it's not going to be delayed by 1,000 years. Therefore, it's right around the corner. You haven't given God a chance for the second coming to happen. You're jumping the gun. And he doesn't make those arguments. He actually says, well, God wants all people to repent. And, the flood was a sudden catastrophe. And of course, readjusting that standard of time, saying, well, our time and God's time are two different standards. So I think that, I'm laying out my theory, and I know you might not agree with it, but I think I've got a very strong I think that it's a very strong theory, and I don't think it's going to be easily debunked. In fact, I would debate anyone in the octagon, a live debate in front of a live audience. I would debate anyone on this because I think I can prove that this epistle here is being written post failure or post postponement, however you want to phrase it. If it was written before AD 70, then he should have been teaching that it was the 11th hour because, of course, his last apostle, with John, they were about to die, and Christ still had time to come, right? So those are my arguments. I know that's not, let's see. Yeah, so those are my arguments, basically. And let me see if I have any questions. Let's see. Dion Sanchez. So he says, who says they didn't happen on time? I don't know what he's referring to. Who said they didn't happen on time? Well, if you go back to, say, Matthew chapter 10, and this is one of the passages I used to show that it was contingent and conditional, because Christ said, "Ye shall not have gone through the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come." Well, they had already gone through the cities of Israel by like AD 42. That's why they extended the gospel to the Greeks and why they established a new Gentile center at Antioch, because they had already gone through the cities of Israel and Christ still hadn't come. So during this time frame, he could have come in AD 33, he could have come in AD 40, he could have come in AD 50. It wasn't on a set schedule. In fact, the language of Scripture is, the day is drawing nigh, the day is drawing near, the Lord is at the door, the Lord is drawing nigh. It's not that we're drawing nigh to it. It's not like we're getting closer to Christmas or we're getting closer to Thanksgiving or the 4th of July. It's not like that it's on a set date and that we're getting nearer to it. It's like it's drawing nearer to us. It's at the door. It's drawing near. And so it was near during that 40-year period. It could have happened, and of course it didn't. And so Peter's drawing is of course arguing against the notion. What he's basically saying, Dion, what he's basically saying is he's saying that he's not denying that the second coming had failed. His argument is that it didn't ultimately fail. And this is why this really helps bolster my my podcast that I did a few days ago. It's called I forget the title. It was it's the one that said is Revelation a failed apocalypse? Because I said in that, and then in the one that I did with New Heaven and New Earth in SoCal Preston, I said, this is a failure. Now, you could look at failure in a number of different ways, but what Peter is saying, and he's saying it's true what he's saying. It's truth that he's writing here, whoever the author is. He's saying that he's not denying that it failed. What he's saying is that it didn't ultimately fail. In other words, failure to happen in a specific time frame doesn't mean that it ultimately failed, because if you go back and you look at the prophecies of the first advent, where all these things were supposed to happen, like some prophecies were supposed to be fulfilled during the time of Ahaz, other prophecies were supposed to be fulfilled during the time of Hezekiah when they were written to those specific audiences, the 70 years of captivity, then they were supposed to be restored. Well, they didn't happen on time. But then ultimately, we find that the Jews were still waiting for them, and then they did ultimately happen. So he's using the same paradigm, and this just basically reinforces everything that I've written on this topic, and also everything that we've said in recent podcasts. But this is my theory. Again, take a look at it. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, then we can talk about it. But he says, let's see, Jesus came at the end of the Jewish age. Daniel's timing. Well, he did come at the end of the Jewish age, and I'm fully in agreement about that. But he was supposed to come twice. Remember, he was supposed to come twice. So he came once at the end of the age, at the end of the Mosaic age, but then he went away, and he was supposed to return. So it's that second time that we're talking about here. And so Jude said that this second time was supposed to happen during his lifetime of his contemporary audience. that all of these false teachers were supposed to be destroyed. The Lord was going to reward everybody according to their works. Peter said, judgment is about to begin at the house of God, and nothing happened. The false teachers were still there. 20 years later, when Second Peter was written, the discrimination between the wheat and the tares hadn't taken place. The nations hadn't been judged. Israel hadn't been regathered. The tribes hadn't been, and we could spiritualize these. I understand. Look, I understand you can spiritualize the language. That's perfectly fine. But I mean, the more of that you do, the less credible it sounds, because you have to spiritualize like everything. You can't just spiritualize like one or two things like, oh, okay, I understand, destruction of the temple. Yeah. Coming in clouds, Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 19. I understand that. But now regathering Israel. Okay. Well, it was only the elect. We hear these arguments. Resurrection. I mean, resurrection, the destruction of false teachers. Come on, the judgment of nations, of the Gentile nations. You can keep spiritualizing it, but eventually it runs out of credibility. I mean, you can only go so far with that line of apologetics. And so again, I think you just have to exercise common sense. But anyways, that's my theory. I didn't want to make it too long. I do want to say, though, I just had another word. I was going to say this at the beginning, but look, I don't mind people weighing in, and I don't mind people, commenting. But some of the comments that have come through, and I'm not going to mention any names, is like one or two people that are starting to be really rude and disrespectful. And look, I respect everybody. I give everybody a chance. I give everybody a chance to come on the show to talk in a real-time environment where you're not going to be mowed down. You're not going to be, you're not going to be beat up. Nobody's going to jump you. And they've refused to meet me, and Dave and Jeremy as well, in a real-time environment. That's fine. If you don't feel comfortable, getting on the air and talking these things over with us, that's perfectly fine. But don't come to my channel and disrespect us and be rude and be abrasive and troll. If you want to engage in genuine theological discourse, if you want to engage in civil discourse with us, that's great. But what I will say is there's other people that I've had to ban from this channel, not preterists either. There's a couple futurists, maybe 3 or 4 of them, that I've had to ban from this channel, not because they disagree with me. Look, I could disagree with people, all day long. We can do this. It's when they disagree and they show lack of respect, and they show lack of etiquette and decorum. And so I just want to make that clear. Another thing is I've tried to answer all of these comments that are coming through, but I only have a limited amount of time to do like back and forth. So I know some people have weighed in with some really great comments. I know Matt Galante, he's given me some stuff, some food for thought. And I plan on, I plan on answering. But it's a lot, this is the reason why I started the channel, is because I wanted to do real-time discussion, and I got tired. I was on Don Preston's forum for like 2 years, going back and forth with those guys, just in the comments section. And I realized, I said, well, at some point, this may be great training wheels, right? But at some point I need to get to the next level. And so I started this channel to, because I wanted more real-time discussion, and I can do that. I can real-time it with anybody. And so that's what I want to do. And so, because I can't, answer every single question, don't think that's a win, and don't think that I can't answer it. It's just, I don't have the time. I'm busy doing this. And also I have a job, and I also have other things to do. And so again, thanks again for tuning in. Thanks again for hearing me out. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. And also, if anybody wants to talk about this via live stream, let me know that as well. We will arrange it. I guarantee you we will arrange it. But until then, I hope everybody has a great rest of your weekend. Be safe, and I'll talk to you soon.